Thank you. We had, as you well know, a number of us appeared before the selectmen last night. Two of our selectmen are here. Thank you for coming, both Bonnie and I think I saw Bill. Somebody there. Thank you very much. And a number of employees are here to ask questions, and I think we've got some questions. One of the things I will say, Joellen, that we have come to, I still feel that what you have done is great work and is thorough. There are a few gaps which I think we started to talk about that we would like to fill in before we make some final decisions. But I and my colleagues are very grateful for the time and effort that you put into talking to employees. You know, you've already spoken to that, and getting with those employees to try to understand what their jobs are. There's some, I won't say dissension, but some questions about some of the things, which I'm sure that you can help address. But I think most importantly, and what I made very clear to the board, is that we're going to need your help for a bit longer for sure. And in some cases, I feel that some of the work that we would be asking you to do represent change order. And so I do believe, nice one, you okay? The equivalent of a change order, if you will. And so that we'll be seeking some manner in trying to make sure that you're remunerated for that. So just bear that in mind, okay? So we still need you, is what we're saying. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Do you want me to respond? Okay. Or do you have a question? I don't. Yes, I will need your help then. Okay, so I should stand on this side.
Yeah.
Right? So, good evening. Oh, now all right, this is...
That's okay.
Don't be offended if I don't come this way. Okay, so just initially, what I'd like to say is it's good to be back. Thank you for having me. Heidi and I, when we were out last in November, had a very good visit with the employees of the town. Everyone was very well prepared. The information that we received from the town administration was excellent. So we really felt that we could come in and do our work as far as meeting with the employees and finding out what they did for the town. So I want you to know that up front that was a really good visit, and we got a lot of information. Normally, when we go through this process, the information, that raw data that you received, is generally something I give to a client to just say, does this make sense? It's a cursory overview. Because that was discussed ahead of the written narrative, it creates questions, which is completely understandable. So I tailored the presentation tonight in a little bit more detail to try and get to some of those particular questions that were raised. I probably cannot answer every question in detail through the presentation, but certainly if people ask questions, I'm happy to address them. And there are reasons and a methodology as to why the study was approached the way it was. So I'm prepared to explain that. So with that, Vanessa.
Do you want to take questions during your presentation or at the end?
Well, actually, I'm fine either way.
Okay.
So, I mean, if I'm explaining something and it raises a question in your mind and you want to stop me, that's fine. So either whatever you're comfortable with. Usually, I just say questions at the end, but I'm fine either way.
I will say, to control the meeting, that those questions at first will come from the board. And certainly there'll be plenty of opportunity for anybody in the audience, but I want the board to be satisfied first and understand what it is that we have to deliberate, and then we can kick it to the group, okay?
Okay, so
Thank you.
Can just recognize.
I will recognize.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, so as far as the outline of the presentation, here are all of the things that I'm going to talk about. And some of them are easier and faster to go over, such as the scope of work. I'll talk about the job evaluation process, the proposed classification plan, the proposed job titles, and some positions that are affected by title changes, the compensation survey we completed, the findings of that compensation survey, the proposed classification plan, how you would go about implementing the class and comp plans, and then how you would administer the system in the future. So initially what you asked us to do was complete a classification and compensation study. I was out here in October initially. I met with you and talked to you generally about expectations, met with the employees. handed out the job analysis questionnaire and explained what the study entailed and kind of the work that we needed people to complete before we could come back and interview the employees in November. Also at that time, we talked about communities that would be comparable to the town of Southborough and how we would go about establishing comparability. We distributed the information, as I indicated, to the employees. And then we started on the job analysis and the establishment of the classification system. After we were here in October, that's okay, we sent out the salary survey and we received the results. And we got very good results, about 87% response. We did that analysis, and then as a result of that analysis, I sent that giant spreadsheet to you, the preliminary findings, and then after that, I wrote a narrative that went along with that. So tonight, what you have in front of you is a final draft report. That gives you an opportunity to say, could you drill down more here? We need some more analysis here. It's not finished yet. It's generally finished, but obviously there are questions and you may need some more analysis done before it's actually finalized. So the first part of the job evaluation was to look at all of the positions in the town. There are 31 classifications that we looked at. And the reason why we do that is we want to create a structure of internal equity or a classification plan for the town. And in doing that, we looked at all of the positions that you asked us to look at, the 31 classifications, and we looked at each position and 9 factors related to each of the positions. So every position has an educational requirement. Every position has a number of years of experience that are needed to perform the work. We ask people about how much autonomy they have in their work. What happens if they make an error? How much latitude do they have in establishing policy for the town? Are they responsible for a department? Are they responsible for the work of others? How many people do they supervise? Do they supervise? What type of contact do they have with people that are coming into the community? Are they the spokesperson for the community in a particular area of expertise? Can they bind the community if they're out at a meeting in another community and say, yes, Southborough is going to do that, and then Southborough is found? We also talk about working conditions. You know, are people expected to go out in the field, or are they generally in the office? And then the last factor relates to the use of technology. We found over the years that there's no position really in local government anymore that doesn't have some level of technological expertise needed. So those are the 9 different factors that we look at in creating a job value. And there is a value for each one of those factors. And we look at all of those factors in relation to all of the positions in the community and come up with a classification plan. And that's how we establish what we call internal equity. So when we did the job evaluation, we met with not every employee, but at least one employee in each classification on site. And as I said, Heidi Voorhees and I came out in mid-November and did that. And we separated the positions. Heidi was down at Public Works for a while. She was at the libraries, and I was generally here. So we met with employees to get a good feeling of what they did. We understand that when we're looking at a classification plan in a community, that while communities, you know, in your comps, Hopkinton, and Southborough, and Northborough, and Westborough, have similar jobs, similar titles, there's nuances to those jobs in a particular community. So we strive to understand that and how everyone works in Southborough. That's why we feel it's important to talk to the employees. Even though there were some employees that came to meetings together with others that share the same job title, that doesn't necessarily mean the result is going to be that they're still in the same job title. We understand that there's differentiations in jobs, but because they were sharing a classification, it was important that they come together. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Again, the classification plan that we're recommending was based on internal equity, and that's, again, how the positions relate to each other in the town of Southborough. If you look at the classification plans in other communities, they may be not exactly the same. And there's reasons for that. You have to look at the organizational structure. You may have a position in Southborough that reports to a department head, but in another community, there is the same position that is the department head. So we really need to understand that organizational structure in order to make a recommendation that's appropriate for this community. As a result of our study, we've determined that there are a few jobs that resulted in a reclassification.
So you were able to determine in another community where that position was reported, or you just within our community?
Well, I have additional information that some of the employees supplied, and so based on what I looked at, there's different situations in different communities,
Right.
and that's
Right.
evidenced through the salary information we received and the information they submitted. So what exists in one community isn't necessarily appropriate in Southborough because there's a different hierarchy and a different
Right.
organizational
Yeah.
structure. So what I'm suggesting is the classification plan that we created is for your community. Takes all that other information into consideration, but the internal equity is all about Southborough and how your departments are structured. There are a few classifications that we recommended for reclassification, meaning to a different level, different grade within the system. I gave some examples here. One is the assistant town clerk. In that position, what we learned is right now in Southborough, the town clerk is part-time. So the assistant town clerk is really working at a level because she is the person that is generally responsible for what's happening in that office. Although there is a town clerk, that person is the point person for your community. If the town clerk was no longer the town clerk and you decided to do something different with the assistant's job, then that could change in the future. But right now, that position is the point person for the community. Therefore, it's been recommended to be at a higher grade. Another example is the administrative assistant 2. When I met with the administrative assistant 2s, and there were several people in that classification, it was very clear to me that there were some of the people in that classification that were working at a different level than others. And you have an administrative assistant 2, an administrative assistant 3. So what we're recommending is that the administrative assistants 2 job, not in all of the departments, in some of the departments we changed to a principal department assistant to recognize the autonomy that the people have in performing their work and the complexity of the work. And it's a little bit different than some of the other administrative assistants. So that's a reclassification as well, an example of a reclassification. And also, one of the things that we heard through our process is that, it would be really better if this person had this role. And there's a couple of examples here in the assessor's office and in recreation. We understand that there's a desire to possibly change those positions to have a different type of focus. However, we classified the jobs based on the information we received. So if the personnel board said, Joellen, could you do this? Could you create this job? I will help you do that for at least a year. You don't have to pay extra for that. That's part of what we do.
We have a year guarantee for
You have a year.
Wow, that's unusual. Thank
I'm
you.
a resource for you. So the town will have the mechanism to maintain your classification plan, but if you have an employee fill out another questionnaire and you want to create a new job and you say, hey, Joellen, can you take a look at this? I'm happy to do it. And we can talk over the phone, conference call, or whatever.
I want to interrupt. One of the selectmen has a question.
Well, this came up last night. When you just said the town will have the mechanism, is that an electronic tool? What do you mean when you say that?
Well, there's a few tools that go along with this system. One is the questionnaire that the employees filled out, which is electronic. They could fill that out. They could give it back to the town administrator's office. And then the tool that we use to create the classification plan and the internal plan is, it's in a PDF format, but you take that tool and then you value the job. So, I mean, I could email it, but it's not an electronic system.
When you say to maintain the plan, there's no wrong answer, but I'm just trying to understand what that means.
Sure.
Uh,
So the classification plan that had the different grades and all of the job, if for some reason the Commonwealth says, you now have to do X service, and you say, oh, we have to create a new job, the town has all of the information in order to create the job without a consultant. I'm giving you the system so you can maintain it.
The system.
The system.
So I think
Meaning the
that's
scale.
helpful.
The
Yes,
scale,
yeah.
the point factor
scale
system
based on
that the
education.
town will have.
Yeah, no,
The GFA.
and that's, I think that was, in the draft report, that might have been misconstrued by one of the members last night, so I appreciate the clarification on that.
Sure. So again, I will be a resource, I'll always be a resource, but for that first, period of time, the questions, you ask the questions, and until everybody gets comfortable, the person on board gets comfortable with using the system.
Great, thank you. And he was a former member, so that's why he's asking.
Okay. So as a result of our on-site meetings, the information that the employees presented, we came up with a classification plan. So the next 3 slides I couldn't fit it onto one slide, but this is the classification plan. It has 9 grades, and the grades are from 1 through 9. Generally, how I create classification plans is I'll group types of jobs together. So grades 7 through 9 are your department heads and management staff, starting out with the superintendent of public works, down to the town planner. One of the things, too, I want to talk about with job evaluation is how do these jobs end up getting grouped together? Somebody may say, well, why is my job not at grade 9? Why is it in grade 7, for example? There's several reasons why that happens. For one reason, there could be a hierarchy. There could be a professional in grade 7 who is reporting to a department head in grade 9. So they both can't be at grade 9. They may have the same level of complexity in their work, but one of the jobs is ultimately responsible for the department. That's an example. Some of the jobs in grade 7 have high levels of education that are needed, master's degree, or advanced certifications, but they don't have a large scope as far as the number of people they supervise. So they don't get as many points for that. They may have a high level of independent judgment in their job, but they may be in the office and they don't have a high level of a requirement of going out in the field. So we look at all of those 9 factors and then they're graded, and that's how they come out. So we take into consideration the hierarchy of the town, which may not exist in other communities, so that's something that people need to think about. And then we look at all of those factors and how they relate to one another.
Explain, just so you have to us, but so everybody here, explain what you're meaning by the skill level range, because when I look here in 7, it says 585 to 630, but I don't see 585 here, unless it's on that.
No, what that means is if you had, again, we'll use the Commonwealth telling you have to provide a new service and you have to create another job. When you use the tool and you score it, if it scores between 585 and 630, it
That's
would
the
go
proper
into grade
placement.
7. Right. So right now, there's no job that scored 585. So that's what that means.
But it's available.
It's
If
exactly.
that's the case. Thank you.
Yes. The next grouping down, grades 4 through 6 are people that are considered supervisors and technical staff. You can see here, there's a differentiation in some of those jobs. The assistant town clerk, you can see, is up at a little bit higher level than where it may have been grouped before. Again, that's because of the discussion of how that job is functioning today in Southborough. So there's a change there. So again, looking at all of the positions, looking at the level of complexity, looking at the technology that people use, if they supervise people or not, if they are supervised, what happens if they make a mistake. That's how these jobs are scored and how they are grouped in relation to one another. And then the last part of the classification, grades 1 through 3, are administrative and support staff. And again, the same logic is applied here as well, as we look at the 9 factors. Grade 1 would be any job that is scored up to 260 points, okay? And then they're broken out into smaller ranges as you go up through grade 9. So we've recommended that there are some title changes as a result of our assessment. And the director of the Recreation Commission, and we base the title changes on a couple of things. One would be on the duties that are being performed, just generally it is more appropriate for the duties that are being performed. And the other is what we are seeing in the market. So when we did the compensation survey, we also asked that titles be provided. And so, for example, in the superintendent of public works, almost everyone came back director of public works. So in that case, we're recommending that is a title change. So you can see on this slide the different title changes that we're recommending. The administrative assistant 3, we're recommending to be a principal department assistant. The administrative assistant 2 and the receptionist, we're recommending them be called administrative assistant. However, the current administrative assistant 2s, we're recommending some of them be principal department assistants and some remain as administrative assistants. The next part of the analysis was to complete the compensation study. And when I was here in October, we talked a little bit about creating communities that are comparable to the town of Southborough. Sometimes when consultants are looking at compensation, they'll look at population and proximity. What we like to do when we're coming to you and recommending salaries is to actually take financial information into consideration. So when we are surveying communities, we want to make sure that those communities are communities that have a similar ability to pay. So if we come and make a recommendation, we don't want to say, we think you should pay your employees this, and then you say, well, why would you compare us to that community? We don't think we're like that community. So as one of the appendices to the report, we show how we came up with these the comparable communities, how it's scored, the world of communities to which Southborough could be compared, as well as the communities that we recommended. And the different criteria relate to population and proximity, and then you can see all of the financial factors that we worked in. So as a result of that analysis, here are all the communities that we determined to be comparable to Southborough, with the exception of Framingham. So from Ashland down to Westwood, we determined those communities to be comparable, or at least most comparable to Southborough based on our analysis, and we requested salary information from them. As a result of our discussion, it was requested that we ask Framingham for salary information only because of the proximity and the probability, or I guess at times people may tend to work for the town of Framingham, so it would have been nice to see what they were paying their employees. So that's why Framingham's listed there. 15 communities were chosen to determine external equity. So again, we talked about internal equity, which was the classification plan and talking to all of the employees and creating that hierarchy. Then we go outside of the organization based on establishing comparable communities to gather salary information to determine what's externally equitable. Again, Framingham is not a comparable community. We just requested the compensation or the information about salaries due to the proximity to Southborough. 13 of the 15 communities we requested information from did respond. Ashland and Grafton did not, nor did Framingham. So we don't have Framingham's information. But as a result, the response rate was 87%, which we think was excellent. So we gathered a lot of data through the compensation survey. And when we request data in a compensation survey, we define the position that we're requesting salary information about. So even though in some communities, the town administrator is the town administrator or the town manager, and that one's pretty easy to know that you're comparing the right job. Others are not as easy. So we take the time to define the job, and then we send a salary survey out and request information related to the title that they use in their community, the minimum and maximum salaries, and if they don't have a salary range, we ask for actual salary data. I have on the slide, salary ranges are the preferred method to gather salary data. And I know that some people are asking, well, what's the actual salary paid in another community? We only will use actual salaries in our analysis if we can't get the salary range. It's a much better method and data point or data points that you could use if you have the range. If you only have an actual salary, then you have to build a range. And depending on what we're looking at, you would have to take that information and determine a minimum and then a maximum. So the only time we would ever use actual salaries is if we can't get the ranges. And we much prefer to work with the ranges because they really are the true market value of a position.
So this came up a lot last night, and that makes it a bit more clear, because when you find an actual, you have to kind of read into what that means. That actual was created when, how much time has that person been in the job, where are they on the scale now, and that's an awful lot harder to gain, or to gauge rather than what you just said, the range.
Right, it is, because, and it's not the market for the job. There is a range for every job. And you don't know how long the person's been in the position, and that's not as relevant if you have a range. A range is a much better look at the market value of the job. And as we talk about the structure of the compensation plan for the town of Southborough, you look at a person and their qualifications when they're coming into a position, and you determine where you want to hire them within that range.
Is it useful to have, when you have the range, to have also the actual, so you can see where the people are being paid relative to the range, so you can see if they're all at midpoint or higher or lower, so that we get a feel for that when we look at competition?
Well, the problem with that is you could have somebody that's paid at the higher end of the range that's a new employee.
I appreciate there's a lot of complexity that
right.
you don't know with one point of information. I'm
right.
just saying, is it useful to see?
I mean, if you're interested in that, it would be interesting to get the information, but if you have the range, you know generally that everyone's paid somewhere within that range.
Right, but I know the pushback is always, well, they're always paid, let's say at the high end, so now we're competing with, and so we don't have any information to talk about that.
Well, I think that if the market will dictate, so if say somebody is paid in another community at the high end of the range,
right.
They may or may not choose to come here if your salary range is not going to give them a similar or higher salary.
True, and the
or
other thing
the
I was
potential
thinking
for
was,
correct.
If with all this range information, which is all terrific, if all these communities turn out that they're really using that range, but they're hiring people or paying people at the higher end of the range, that range, you wonder the value of the range, you know what I'm saying?
Well, and I think that's why you have a range of 40% for your department heads. You may have somebody that will come in that should not be at the midpoint in the range because they're newer to the profession. It gives you the flexibility to slot someone in based on their experience. If you have a vacancy and you in a position where there's a range and you advertise at the starting salary at the bottom to maybe the third up or maybe halfway up to the midpoint, and you get no applicants, then you know that the range is not appropriate. The other comment that I have on this slide is that the data that we received is the market data. So a question that somebody may have about when was the last time they looked at their salaries that is not as relevant because it's market. So if another community has not given raises in 4 years, it's still the market value of that job. Another community, Concord's a good example, has very high salaries. And one would assume, and maybe that's not correct, that they have been regularly adjusting their ranges. But unless you go and ask them and drill down, you don't know for sure. So when you look at some communities, it looks as if their ranges have been maintained because they're higher than South Shores, and others are more comparable, and they may or may not have been changed over a period of time, especially through the recession. But regardless of how current or how often they've been changed, it's still the market for your positions. So I know that that's sometimes hard to get your head around, but that's the reality of the situation. So we wouldn't go back to every community and say, what were the last cost of living increases or general increases or merit increases, and you should have done this, because employees are still working there. That's the market. Okay? Okay. So the next slide talks about the proposed compensation system.
Just one thing, the last comment, data gathered is the current market for the position in the surveys, regardless of adjustments made. I don't understand what that means.
It's just what I was just saying.
Oh, that's the... Yeah,
that's how I
okay.
wrote down what I was
All right, fine.
saying.
Thank you.
Sorry. Okay, the proposed compensation plan is calculated at the 65th percentile. We talked about percentiles and what they mean, but generally, if you're at the 65th percentile, it means that 65% of the data is below that level, and 35% is above. The conversation that we had was that Southborough, as a payer, would like to be a little bit higher than the 50th percentile, or meaning right in the middle. So the ranges that were calculated are based on the 65th percentile. They are not exactly at the 65th percentile because, as you can see as we go through the slide, we want to have a relationship between the minimum salaries of every grade. So it's very difficult when you're looking at grade, the range spreads, and the gradation, meaning how much higher is starting pay at grade 2 to grade 3 to grade 4 to get them exact. But they're as close to the 65th percentile as seems appropriate. Some might be a little bit higher, some might be a little bit lower. But as I mentioned, there's 9 compensation grades and ranges established. 1 through 3 are the administrative and support staff. 4 through 6 are the supervisory and technical staff, and 6 through 9 are your department heads and management staff. And then there's different range spreads from minimum to maximum depending on the band, so to speak. So grades 1 through 3 are a band. They have a 30% spread from the minimum salary to the maximum salary, and grades 4 through 6 is 35, grades 7 through 9 are 40, and then between grades 1 and 6, the minimum pay is 7.5% higher. So grade 2 is 7.5% higher than grade 1, all the way up through grade 6. When you get up into your department heads and management staff, there's more. It's just because of what the market is saying. You need to start those salaries higher. So it's 17.5% between 7, 8, and 9. The other part of the compensation plan is how the plan is structured. And I talk a little bit in the report about an open range plan, the benefits of an open range plan, some of the advantages and disadvantages. But generally, in an open range merit plan, employees move through the range based on performance. And it's exactly what you were discussing this evening. You go through a performance appraisal. Depending on how you do with that performance appraisal, your pay is adjusted. And in the case here, it's reviewed by the supervisor, the town administrator, and the personnel board. And also, I just reiterated the point that any compensation change in the town of Southborough is based on merit. You don't award just a general increase here.
So I have a question about that. How do you hold the reins on the pay grades if it's conceivable that an employee could advance pretty quickly up to the top of the pay grade
and then there's maxed out?
Yes.
Well, there's several things you can do in that scenario. And that would be a decision, a local decision, but I have ideas. One would be if an employee is a performer where they get to the maximum, you want to continue to recognize a high-performing employee. You don't want to award a pay increase and work it into the base, because that would be skewing the market value for the job. Rather, what you could do is award that percentage increase or a lump sum amount as a one-time merit bonus. So you switch then from the merit that gets worked into the base to the merit bonus. And that's something that you could consider doing as you see your employees all going to max. I mean, the other thing you would want to, well, there's enough, I'll get into it a little bit later, but when you're maintaining your ranges, you know, one of the things in order to do that is to be looking at the market every year to make sure that you're adjusting your ranges to keep up with the market as well.
And if I guess she's a new member, but that's something that we've done at least 3 times where we have adjusted because so many people are hitting the top that we take the bottom and so we subtract. So if the bottom is at 35 and the next step was at 40, then what you do is you add that other 5 on the other end, and we do that on a regular basis over and above what the compensation plan study is. So that's what will happen. But I like what you're suggesting, the one-time bonus. That's an interesting concept.
What you're saying sounds like you could really inflate quickly, though.
No, not really, because it's not done yearly. At the best, we might have done it every 2 or 3 years or so, but only when we were beginning to see people creep to the top, and that we recognized that, you know, what are we going to do now? And again, historically, as I had said, and Joelle, you may know this, when we had 1 through 8, we had a scale with 1 through 8. There were steps, and that number 9 was an asterisk. So 8 was the number that was on that particular scale. The asterisk was that would be handled on a case-by-case basis when people reach the maximum. Then we stopped doing that because we were trying to avoid that from happening as a case-by-case, and we would adjust it. This is a more formal way of doing it because we're looking at ranges, but we did that based on what we felt we could afford. So we've gone through that, the machinations for that. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So then here's the proposed compensation plan. A couple of things here. As you can see, there's a range for the position at the 65th percentile. There is a recommended compensation range with a minimum, midpoint, and maximum, and then on the far right column, there's the actual salary in Southborough. I put the date of October 2014 because I think that was the time, it's either October or November, when I received the compensation data, and some of that has changed. So some of the Southborough data might be out, and we can certainly update that, but just so you're aware. So if you're looking at some of the positions within the grades, you can see that the ranges vary a little bit. What I tried to do was really look at all of the data there and somehow average where I could to get those compensation ranges set. You'll see some might be a little bit higher, some might be a little bit lower, but they're generally at the 65th percentile. The other thing to keep in mind too is while, you know, you might say, oh, well, look at the assistant town administrator, that top pay is $111,000. Okay, that would be true at the 65th percentile, but then we look at the internal equity. So like I was saying, you know, those 4 top salaries there in grade 8, I would average that, kind of look at it, where does it come in relation to that $102,000, and that's how the range is set.
Right.
Okay, so when this is being calculated, you have to look at the data and all of the data within the grade, not just the high data or the low data. So those are your grades 7, 8, and 9. The next slide will show grades 4 through 6, and then the last slide is grades 1 through 3. And this table is the table 1 in your report. So after you read all the narrative, this is the first table that you see. The next thing, the next slide is about the implementation of the class and comp plan. So how now do you take this? You started talking a little bit about the different points and things and how you will implement something like this. So The first part of it would be if you wanted to do any job description updates as a result of this, just making sure that that happens. You've got a lot of information now. I brought the copies of the books with me, but we have everything collected electronically to make any updates and apply the new titles if it's warranted. The next thing that you would want to do is to move your current employees into the compensation plan. And when that happens, there's a few ideas here of how to go about doing that. The first one is if an employee's present compensation is below the minimum compensation for the range, we always recommend that that employee be moved to at least the minimum. And the simple reason for that is because if that person, I like to say, won the lottery, gave the notice, left tomorrow, and you advertise for the position, you would have to, in order to get somebody at the market rate, offer that minimum. So what that says, if somebody's below the minimum, is that they're being undercompensated based on the market, and we recommend they at least be brought up to the minimum of the range. The second part of that is if employees' current compensation falls within the new range, that they simply just move into their new grade, and they just get slotted at their current rate of pay. That raises another issue, and that has to do with longevity of the town. The pay ranges in Southborough need to be adjusted, in my estimation, based on the data that we receive from the market, and you're doing that. But when you look at your long-term employees, some of them would have a new rate of compensation that's closer to the bottom of the range. And you can look at that a lot of different ways. I mean, you can say, we're in the range, that's fine, we're going to move forward, and we'll give you a performance review, and based on merit, we'll move you up. Others may say, well, I've been here for a long time, I should at least be in the middle of the range. And that might cost a lot of money to do, especially if they're towards the bottom. So one idea that you could consider is also offering an additional movement in compensation based on tenure. And so the table that I have here is an example of something that you could do, just simply based on the tenure that somebody has with the organization. It doesn't mean that they have to be at the middle, because that's really not necessary. What you're doing is you're making an adjustment to compensation based on a study, and you're moving in the right direction. So you could come up with a different way of recognizing longevity if you choose to do so. So this table illustrates a percentage increase based on longevity. You could do a flat dollar amount. There's lots of options. But the idea is that you take that into consideration for your longer-term employees.
So a question that I don't know if it's clear about, but if that's something that we chose to adopt, is that a one-time adjustment?
Yes.
That longevity?
Yes, it would be one time. The other thing is you could phase your implementation. You know, the first thing that I said about anyone who's under the range really should be brought up at implementation. This second part, you could do it later in the year to recognize employees, but maybe not have the full impact of the cost. But it still goes into their base pay, so you are recognizing their longevity, and you could figure out what's appropriate from a cost standpoint.
Are you taking questions as you go along?
We're only for the boards, so the Board of Selectmen and the board
Okay,
right now.
so on this slide, thank you. You've got develop a template and move core employees into the new plan with the following assumptions, and you've got two large bullets. And then you've got this note. So is this note rise to the level of the previous two bullets or not? And if so, it's not, why
It's an
not?
option.
It's an option. Some communities will just move people in. I think here you have a lot of people who are at the lower end, and so to me it's an issue. And so I wouldn't say don't consider it. I think it's something that the town should consider doing. And I gave you an example of how you could do it. I think you'll hear about it from employees, because a lot of them will be closer to the bottom of the range. So I included it because I've anticipated.
It's a way, and in my mind, what I'm hearing too, Paul, is it's a way to move people closer, further away from the bottom in incremental steps.
Some communities, I mean, some communities are not interested in it at all. Others, I mean, we do a lot of work, and as a result of the recession, they're not. And so I think Southborough's open to that conversation, and that's why I have it included as a way you can do it.
I understand. I'll get a big boo for this, but you've spent all this time figuring out what the range should be. And then, and what this says to me is that you're saying, but if you're at the lower end, it's not really good enough. So you're essentially moving the range if we were to do this.
No.
Which I'm not saying we would or we wouldn't. It's not up to me anyway.
Well, there's a market value of a job. There's a minimum and a maximum. But say you've been here for 20 years, okay? And your job is 2% higher than the minimum. What that tells me is that the compensation level for that job has been too low for a long period of time. Now, there's things to consider. If the employee has never received a merit increase, and that's why that's why I'm saying this is an example. You need to think about that for the community. But that's, on the face of it, that's what it tells me. So if I'm an employee sitting here going, boy, you know, it's a great place to work. There's wonderful people that work here. There's all positive things that you want to consider. But it's a gesture to say, hey, okay, you know, you've been here, you've been doing a great job. We want to reward you for that. And it just moves the person higher in the range. It doesn't change the compensation range. It just moves that individual salary a little bit higher. Now, if you did that, I would not, this would be for everyone. This is not, this person can have it and that person can't. It would be a recognition that the system, you know, you're taking this into consideration in the implementation of the system. Okay? So it's kind of an ancillary clause.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, as far as the future of the system, one of the things that we were just talking about was the compensation range, and how do you make sure that those market adjustments continue, which gets back to the point that you just raised. So every year, ideally, you now have comps. You could send an email to those comps and say, are you adjusting your pay ranges by a general increase, a cost of living increase? You can take that into consideration, and you can make a recommendation to adjust the ranges. So what that does is it allows you to stay current with market. So you're not falling behind. If you're doing it every 3 to 5 years, inevitably you'll fall behind. So now because you have the data and you know who your comps are, it's a quick, you know, literally an email you can send every year during budget time to find out what's happening in the market. The next part of it is to create your merit pool through the budget process. And essentially what you need to do here is just determine how much of a merit increase you would like to get, up to a certain amount, and then you would calculate that based on your salaries and put that aside into your merit pool. You know, there's lots of different ways you can look at it. I'm sure the finance director can figure out the best way, because not everybody has it for the year. I mean, you know, you could figure it out. But the idea is that you're setting aside an amount of money in order to give merit increases based on performance. So if everything goes to town meeting, there's approval, you present the market data, and town meeting is supported, you can adjust your ranges, and then you have your pool set aside to award merit throughout the year. Anyone who's not over the maximum compensation and their salary is still within the range would be eligible to receive that merit increase. And as we discussed before, if they reach maximum, then you may want to come up with another mechanism to continue to award performance if you so desire. And that's how you would continue to administer the compensation plan. As far as the classification plan is concerned, you would want to look at your classification plan anytime there's a change to the duties and responsibilities that are being performed by a position. So if you don't need a position anymore, or if you need to create a new position, or in the examples of the assistant town clerk and the administrative assistant too, if the job focus has changed and you want to reclassify it. So when those things are happening and they come to the personnel board, you can then use the tool that you have to look at whether or not you want to make an adjustment to the classification plan. So whether you do that once a year or, every 2 years, you're at least keeping that current too, based on the work that your employees are performing.
So the classification plan, can I translate that to mean job titles?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah,
That's all right.
but they're the same thing, right? So if you need to abolish a title, change a title, create a title,
Yep.
you'll go through your process, and then you, depending on the points that the position scores, you can put it into your classification
I
plan.
got you.
Okay. And that is generally what I have in my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, the board members first. Any questions or comments? Or thoughts?
Well, I personally think it's quite thorough. I think I actually gained a bit of understanding after you explaining it on top of reading it and seeing certain numbers fly across and that sort of thing that gave a bit of clarity to it. I do think that there are a number of board buckets that this drops into, and that we do need to sort of. I know I need to have some time to think about what it is that it all means and
What actions or
What
considerations we have to give?
correct.
Yes.
Obviously, we don't have unlimited time because
No.
we have to make some budget recommendations and some other
Understood.
things. But I think for me, in my mind, this sort of clarifies what the buckets are and
Great.
what decisions
That'll
have
help.
to be made. So.
Okay. Any, Liz?
Yep.
And yourself?
No, I'm set.
Do you, where'd you go? There you go. Do you, one of the things that seems to be coming up is this clamoring for us to consider moving people to the midpoint, almost unilaterally. And do towns do that? And how do they pay for it? Because it could be pretty substantial. And would you move people without merit? Because now what we're facing is, I'm not sure that we can implement this as quickly as we would like to, because we've got town meeting upon us. And we're in the, based on the salary administration plan and what we're guided to do, and that is that at a particular time, and it's right about now, we have to decide what that merit increase might be. We're somewhere between 2% and 3% at least, without voting on it, but that's where we're at. There was even some consideration about a 2.5%, let's aim for 3%, a 2.5% with a 0.5% pool for exemplary, for an almost exemplary pool. That but I think that would require, and I'm saying this to you, but everybody else who's here, many of the department heads, that would require some training and kind of a change in mindset about what you do for those employees, because some people are not going to, in other words, you're grabbing at that 5% or 1% we talked about the other day, those pools that are there for superlative performance, thank you. But some people aren't going to get it, some will and some won't, and not everybody is superlative every year, year after year after year. So help us through that as we begin to digest the change and move, because I like the phasing. I think we have to step into this rather than just jump into it, because I don't think we can afford it completely. So
Right.
help us with that.
It is a quandary.
Thank you.
I mean, I think that people work hard. I think that, at least from the conversation I had, people know what they're doing, they're talented. And you want to reward the performance. What the study is saying, I think, is that the pay needs to be adjusted.
Yeah.
And that's why I give you the idea of how to reward the people that have been here for a long period of time.
That's fine.
I have not seen a client move anyone to a midpoint. It's just cost prohibitive. The idea is that this is great. Everybody has salary growth potential. Now, if I'm sitting there thinking, well, I'm all the way at the bottom, I got to go back through, it's kind of a little disconcerting, but I think that if you could do something to recognize the longevity, that's great. And there's different ways to get there, and it depends on the finances. I think if I was sitting at town meeting, I've been to town meeting many times, and I'm hearing a cost to do that, that could be a non-starter. You know, I think the idea of saying, I think if I was someone sitting there listening to this implementation possibly, the idea of where all the salaries came out and the fact that things should be modified makes sense. I think then going to that next step to take a modest increase makes sense. But I think to do the wholesale, well, because somebody's been here so long, they should be at X, I'm not sure as how someone might hear that.
Yeah.
And I guess I would be concerned about the reception that would receive.
I think something like that would absolutely backfire on us, and so I'm thinking in terms of incrementalism in some way, and I think we'll have to discuss that. I think, you know, so when we talk about changing the grid, I think there's some easy things to adopt. And I also know that there was a number tied to that potential move everybody to the midpoint, and that was $150,000. That's just not going to happen. You know, being fiscally responsible. But what I was saying last night at the meeting over and over again is that we've got to take some action. But I also think, and I really would welcome your point of view on this, as we have made adjustments. So if you were hired 10 years ago, and whatever, you got to the midpoint, and you're finally at the midpoint, and guess what? We moved the scale. So now you're not at the midpoint at all, you have to work your way back up. But in the meantime, you've been getting a 2 or a 3% raise. It's not, so because you're from the midpoint, and we moved the midpoint, that's like saying, well, taxes have gone up, so the midpoint was here, I'd like to be there, well, the taxes have gone up. So as we continue to move the scales, help us understand why that midpoint, why somebody who was at the midpoint and was moved back needs to be at the midpoint with a new, higher scale. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does, but I don't think that that's necessary.
Okay.
I think what I'm suggesting is that we're recommending ranges that allow for more salary growth. That's a good thing.
Yep.
So if somebody's below the midpoint, you could consider doing something. You don't have to. If they're in the
can
range,
move them closer to
if
it,
they're
right?
in the range, they're in market.
Right.
They're in market. So that's a good thing. It's a question of, do you want to do something else? You don't have to do anything because they're in the range, so that's okay.
Understood.
You know, and you could do different things. You could do lump sum. There's lots of different things. You could do people only under the midpoint or only up 10% into the range. You know, I guess if I was analyzing it for the town, I would want to look at longevity, the past increases, the performance, you know, where they are in the range. I mean, there would be a lot of factors to take into consideration to then say, is there any uniformity here, or is it all over the place? And then maybe come up with a recommendation. So I think that's what I would do. I would do a little bit more analysis about exactly where people are, how they got there, how long they've been with the community, and then maybe look at it again.
So if there's an adjustment, and this is a question that Russ whispered to me, if there's an adjustment made because someone is off the grid a little bit, do we have the wherewithal, it seems like we do, to say, we're adjusting you, but that 3%'s not, in other words, that merit's not coming along with it? Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, it's not, if you're saying that somebody is 5,000 off, so we're going to say, okay, we're going to make 5,000 off. What happens to that 3%? Sir, I think that's within our bailiwick to say that 3%'s not going to come for you this year because you're already getting 10%.
I don't know.
Okay, well tell me, explain that to me. Explain that to me.
I would think that if a compensation level is below the minimum,
Yeah.
they're being underpaid.
Understood.
Very simply. So they should not be penalized for good performance. It's not their fault that their compensation level is below the minimum.
Okay.
So if it's an 8% year, then it's an 8% year for
Right.
that person.
Maybe there's another variation where personally, I'm in total agreement with moving the people that are below the minimum up to the minimum. But the other question is, do I do that first and then their regular 3% increase comes into play? Or do I give them the 3% increase, then those who are still below the minimum get moved up to the minimum?
I guess it would depend on
On what the gap is.
What the gap,
no,
yeah.
when does, I didn't think everyone got the 3% at the same time.
It's based on the anniversary.
Right, so
And
I
a lot of them
Gap
are,
through the year.
So
Yeah.
I would just pick the date of implementation,
And
and
just-
whatever the compensation is at that point, whether they just got 3% the day before and they're still below, then you move them up.
Just
Then
move
in
them
that
up, yes,
person's case,
yeah.
it was in the calculation, but then the person whose anniversary date's the next day
Yeah.
might get a little bit more.
Yeah.
I mean, you're gonna have to pick a day of implementation,
And just get it done.
and just get it done.
Yeah, and that's what I totally favor, is to make that happen, because that takes a lot of the sting out of all this. And, yeah, it's money, but that amount of money is not that far out of the range.
okay.
I mean, speaking as also a taxpayer, I don't see, the numbers that I'm looking at,
Yeah,
I mean, it's not a cruiser, it's not a,
Are you talking about the 17,000?
yeah,
$17,000.
just, or even the percentage changes for longevity. I mean,
Yeah.
it's
right,
not,
no,
we're not talking about, large sums.
yeah, we're talking one batch at
Right.
17,000, another batch at about 18,000.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, any questions from either Bonnie or Bill? Yes? No, Bonnie said no.
My
right?
questions have just been answered.
Oh, okay.
Maybe you've touched on some of these and I just missed it, but one thing where you say setting relating to the external market, you're talking only other towns, correct?
Yes.
There's no comparison to say, and most of it could only be like in the administrative assistant 3-2, what it is. Is there ever any comparison to the private sector?
No.
No.
Okay, and why would that be?
Oh, okay. Well,
You're not even close.
Well,
no, it's a valid, it's a question we are asked often. And for people that work in the private sector, they want to know what's the comparability to the private sector. There's several factors, and we've done this numerous times. For one thing, the private sector does not have to supply data. Okay, so it's very difficult to get. Our experience is that we've surveyed over 20 communities, private companies, and we received 2 responses for maybe one position, and unless we have 3 data points, we can't do any analysis. So it's arduous at best to get the data. And then if we do get the data, there's only certain positions that possibly you could even have data for. So for example, you might be able to get some information for clerical positions. You might be able to get some information for IT or finance positions, but not as easily for public works positions, for public safety positions. So you're not getting a true representation of the entire population of employees as you can get when you're getting public sector data. So in addition to that, the whole total compensation package is not being reviewed, which is different usually in the private sector than it is in the public sector as well. So usually we're looking at salary data only. We're not looking at total compensation. So unless that was part of the analysis, then we may seek private sector data if we could get it. But we would only be looking at a piece for a small number of jobs, and we've found that it doesn't really help the analysis.
Because when I look at it from what is the public going to say to me, okay, as a selectman, and what might you hear at town meetings, they're perceived pluses and minuses that people who are working in the private sector, potentially as an administrative assistant, look at some salaries and say, municipal employees, I can understand. At one time, they were paid low and they get great benefits for retirement and other things. But that has changed in the last 20, 30 years, and I think now municipal employees are getting paid as much as me in the private sector, not me, but somebody saying this, and they've still got those great benefits. So, where's the comparability in
Well,
that?
I think another thing to take into consideration is the analysis that we did with regard to the work that people are doing. One very real phenomenon in the private sector that has been significant is the cutback in the positions and the reclassification of work to people who now are doing multiple things, and their classifications are really growing. And it's been very significant. So that is definitely a change that we've seen. And generally and historically, the public sector takes many more years to catch up to the private sector. I mean, you can imagine yourself, I'm sure you've been there, when you try to get another position at town meeting and how difficult that is to get one more job back after you've had to eliminate positions. So that's a factor as well. But you know, I go back to the whole compensation package and the structure, and without doing that analysis, it's difficult to make an accurate comparison. So we tend not to. And I guess the other point I would make too is people who work in the public sector will tend to stay in the public sector. They'll seek other positions in other communities. There's a skill set. There is a level of expertise and experience and job knowledge that people need to work in the public sector. So even if you're working in a frontline position, you know, you're much more desirable to another community than someone from the private sector who has not had a lot of experience dealing with the public, giving that level of customer service that's necessary. So that tends to build on itself because people create a unique skill set.
In a lot of cases, I mean, a finance person in the town is not going to be comparable to a finance person in private business because it's a different way that they do business.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the key things when everybody says, why can't we just do things in the town the way we do it in business? Well, Brian and I can tell you because the state doesn't let you do that. Mm-hmm. So in those cases, there are different. It's hard to compare, but I think when you look at some positions like facility directors and outreach people and administrative assistants, then there's got to be national data on where some of those things fit in. So I think to not try and find some of those comparisons where they're possible, human resources. Kind of human resources, so some of those things I think there are there. And then maybe you find that maybe they're deserving even more because the same thing is being done in the private sector. And those people are making money, or maybe they're making less money. But those are questions. We all know how the town works. There's 7,000 or so registered voters who really don't. So when you try to question that, when you try to push some of this stuff through, wrong choice of words, but advance some of these things, a lot of times there's feedback from people that say, I'd like to have that job. I think they've got a great job. And we don't have anything to say to counter those arguments. And it sounds like it's impossible in a lot of ways, but I think if you had some of that stuff, it's easier to convince some people that it's not necessarily the greatest job. It's no different than yours.
Bill, if I can, question.
Yep.
Any other questions?
Yep. Where you mentioned about the scale sliding, and maybe you explained that, but it seemed to say that each year the scale would slide according to a percentage that you've determined.
Well, I think what I was referring to was in order to keep your pay levels in line with market, you would want to survey the comparable communities to determine if they're adjusting their pay ranges every year.
Okay. I'm kind of confused. See, is further recommendation that the salary ranges for each grade be increased by the average percentage increase of the comparable group? I mean, as other towns.
Right, so if they're all going up 1%, then the recommendation would be that Southborough consider moving the range by also 1% minimum and maximum.
And
not giving a raise, but just moving the range so it stays with the market.
And how do you find that out on an annual basis?
You can survey the communities that were determined to be comparable. So the 15 communities that were determined to be comparable based on proximity, population, and ability to pay, every year you can be talking to colleagues in those communities to say, are you adjusting your pay? For general increase, cost of living increase, get all of that information together, maybe 10 of them are, and then you can have a discussion locally to say, okay, if these 10 communities are adjusting by 1%, then maybe we might want to do that as well, so we're staying with market. If nobody's doing it, then maybe you don't make an adjustment.
So the first one to bite at the apple, whatever, then everyone else follows. But in the way you describe it, it sounds like, okay, everybody's going up 2%. So we're going to slide that scale up. But we recommend a 2% increase for our employees. So
No, it doesn't.
no. We're going to recommend an increase as we do in the salary administration for employees every year, I take it. 2%, 2.5%. And then if every year we're seeing towns are going up 2%, no one moves unless then they're participating in that merit pool, which is getting 2%. So I think looking at sliding every year, I think is unrealistic. If you look at 3 years, 5 years, is what happens with some collective bargaining agreements, then that's an adjust. But I think to possibly adjust a scale every year, there's not going to be a lot of movement within the employees.
John, can I ask, if we were to consider what period of time is good? I mean, presumably, is it July, is it October? In other words, understanding, and you understand, what the period of time is for town meeting and when the new budget takes shape in Massachusetts, it would be July. It would be sometime after July that we would reach out to do that.
Well, I guess, or when communities are, I guess after town meeting.
That's right.
Yeah, you would want to make sure it was approved.
Okay. Yeah. It's important just to understand, whether it's 1 or 2 years, I mean, I understand it's important to do, and absolutely not as we've been doing it in 3 or 5 year increments. I think that's too much of a
And the town
gap.
has been looking at 3 to 5 year changes, and what's the result of that is that it hasn't changed with the market.
Yeah.
Quickly it hasn't changed with the market at the pace that has allowed the compensation to stay at a higher level. So if you're looking at it every year, doesn't mean you have to do it, but at least you're aware of what's happening in the market. That's what the recommendation is to consider doing it every year and consider adjusting it every year, but that's a local decision.
That's helpful. Any other questions from the board members of either board? And if not, I'll open for public comment. No? Okay, public comment.
The admin 2 position, you said some of them you would, I just couldn't find it anywhere to see which ones are supposed to become for the principal administration.
Principal department assistant?
Yes.
Okay,
It was admin 3 at first.
right. Okay, all right, I'm doing this off the top of my head. There is an admin 3 already in the assessor's office. That's recommended to stay the same. There is an admin 2 in planning. That would be a principal department assistant. An admin 2 in building. That would be a principal department assistant. An admin 2 in facilities. That would be a principal department assistant. And the portion of the admin 2 in the assessor's office, that is the admin 2. No, the Board of Health admin 2 would be, that job is kind of split. So that one on implementation will be a little bit more difficult, but not the assessor's portion of that admin 2, that still is an administrative assistant, but the Board of Health portion of that job should be a principal department, is recommended to be a principal department assistant. So I believe those were the departments.
Okay, thank you.
So there was another admin 2 in Public Works that would stay an admin administrative assistant, take off the 2. There was one, I believe, in the clerk's office. The receptionist would then change to an admin assistant. I might be missing one. I have it right. I have it written down, but I'm going off the top of my head. I think, do you recall that?
I'd have to go back to this.
Yeah, I have it
Oh,
somewhere.
it was in the spread, I didn't.
It's not in
figure out where it
the, it's
was,
not
so-
in the report.
Okay.
The people aren't in the report, the positions are in the report,
Right.
but it's been recommended. Our conversation has been that there's differences in the jobs.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any other comments, concerns, questions about the report?
There were, and I don't know if the question's for Joellen or for the board, but there are a few positions within the salary survey that several of us have noticed that we think need to be re-examined. And I'm wondering what the process would be. Should we try to meet specifically with Joellen or talk to the board? How should we go
Joellen
about?
won't do it directly without us asking that to
Okay.
happen. And so, as we said at the last meeting, that bring those things forward. We'll put it, it's not for tonight, but bring those things forward. She has offered to help us look and help us rewrite some of those. So that the idea is that if you feel that way, no problem. That should come from the department head, but in the form of a memo with not so much justification, but with the changes that have happened, changes in your responsibilities, changes in your job sphere. We need to see that in writing, and then we can make those considerations with the assistance of Joel. Okay, and within the next month, if you want to bring it forward, we can consider that. And that goes for any. There were 2 or 3 people who indicated that. I think.
Joellen, typically it seems like municipal jobs, and I came out of the other side, so it's always been a little bit of a mystery to me. But statutory responsibility, people who have to answer to Mass General Law as opposed to more programs or services or things like that, that seems to usually count in job grading. But it's not one of the 9 factors. How does that get worked into the work that you guys have done? Where does that go?
Yes, there's a factor related to independent judgment and decision-making. In the conversations that Heidi and I had with everyone, we talked about autonomy in decision-making. You know, are you responsible for the entire organization, a department, a division? You know, what's the scope of responsibility? The second part of that question is what happens if you make a mistake? Okay? People that are entrusted with the execution of certain laws, fiduciary responsibility, assessing the well-being of an individual, rise to a level of complexity that if they make an error, it could potentially be grave. Public safety is another example. So that's the scale. That is a factor that we take that into consideration when we had conversations with everyone about that. So several of the positions have a pretty high level of independent judgment and decision making because people are entrusted with that responsibility. So that was taken into consideration.
Okay, where it was conveyed well, I guess.
Yeah,
because that goes back to some of the
one of the
questions
factors.
about
I mean,
some of the
that is
positions.
one factor, but there's other factors. There's factors related to policy and how much autonomy and responsibility do you have in creating policy for the town. Now, you know, if the Commonwealth says we have to do this now, then who's responsible for saying, okay, this is how we do it? You know, we have to go in, it has to dovetail with the guidelines that have been stipulated in the statute. This is how we think it has to work in the town. We're creating a bylaw, it has to go to town meeting. People do that. That's another factor. And then there's a factor of planning the work of yourself and other people, which also gets to the level of position in the organization. So if you're a department head, then you're ultimately responsible for everything that happens in that department. You may be a very high-level technician, but you're not the department head, so you cannot rise to the level of the person who has the ultimate responsibility. So again, that's another factor that takes into consideration some of what we're talking about.
Joanne, let's move back if we can. So Joanne, there were a flurry of emails that went back and forth between Vanessa and I think you and myself and the rest of the board that conveyed some concerns or questions about how did you do this and how did you do that and how did you do this. How are we going to resolve those in the future so that we can make some decisions based on that, whether it's email, we bring it back to talk. I'm just curious to know how you think we might best address that with your help.
I think that, as I had suggested to Vanessa, you know, I said it would be helpful if everybody had read the report and I was able to explain it.
Yes.
And hopefully, a lot of the questions that people had, they understand the methodology now, and their questions have been answered. However, there are others that might think that their position is not where it should be, It may have changed. We know, there are a couple of examples that I gave of positions that may need to be reclassified. So maybe just a follow-up with everyone to say, you've read the report, you've heard the presentation, you can watch the tape, and give people a period of time to get back with any follow-up. And then you can send it all to me and I can kind of prioritize or group the concerns into different areas, and then we can just process through.
That's great. And so that goes for anybody, and anybody who's not here, as you speak to your colleagues, that consider what's been said, consider what the report says, consider whether the questions have been answered or not, and if not, what I would suggest is come back at them, because the questions may have changed just a little bit, or the factors that you're concerned with, and just forward that through Vanessa, and we'll work through it. So I'm grateful that you're going to still be on the team with us, because this is going to be a little muddy at first as we consider it. So,
and I guess the final thing I can say about it is that we understand it's an emotional process. People take a lot of pride in what they do and in their work. And compensation it can be emotional. So it's important for us that people understand how we got to our recommendation. And as I said, this is the final draft report. We could have missed something, or we could have not have considered something because you have new information. So that's why we're happy to continue to work with you before it's finalized.
Great. We're glad to have you back in the Commonwealth. Yes, another question.
You know, I never shut up.
No? Go ahead.
And this is kind of going back to, I don't know, I think the last meeting or whatever, but people are still clamoring, I'm clamoring, to know actual salaries. And I totally understand what you say about ranges. Yes, they're very meaningful. Yes, when a town or a company or whatever looks to hire, it makes sense to have a range, because you're not just basing it on the person that was in that job. However, to many people here who keep in touch and gather the information for their counterparts in other towns, it's important, because towns a lot of times aren't real up on updating their ranges, and we have no way of knowing how how up to date the towns that were surveyed. And one of the ways to look at it is, well, if all their employees are in the top 25%, geez, they may not have real current ranges. Bottom line, it's important to a lot of people here of what the current ranges are in the other towns and how long people have been in those jobs. It's meaningful data to a lot of us. Yeah. And so can we pursue getting that information? I think that was part of the original request when all of this stuff started way back when.
Well, the discussion of actuals came up yesterday, and Mr. Rooney from the Board of Selectmen asked, because he felt that it would be valuable. I'm dissuaded by that, by what Joellen says, but I understand it may still be something we're doing, and I think that Mr. Purple was asked to see if we could get some of those or not. And so we'll work on that, and we'll have that discussion. What I will ask Joellen, that plays into what you're saying, is where does Southborough fit, even in the Commonwealth, with what we're asking you to do? Are we at the beginning? Are we in the middle of the pack? I'm not talking about the money, but the fact that we are doing what we asked. You're doing what we asked you to do. Where are we? How many communities are doing this? How many communities are doing it well? Because I will say that in the past we haven't done it well, which I guess is obvious. But where does that put us? That we've taken this step forward to engage you and get this information, would you say? How many municipalities are doing this?
Well, honestly, I don't know in Massachusetts. I would suspect that as a result of the recession, more communities are looking at their pay plans and whether or not they're up to date. But I don't know what other consultants are working in this state. I mean, we're actually going to be at MMA this weekend, so I could gather some more information and find out who's doing class and comp studies.
Well, in the areas, though, municipalities outside the Commonwealth that you're familiar with, does this put us in the middle of the pack? Our attempts to bring this forward?
Yeah, we're busy with class and comps, sure. We have, we're doing a lot, not a lot, but I mean, I've got several that I'm working on right now.
Okay.
And really, it's And what I'm finding is some communities are low. And honestly, you're on the lower end. And I think it goes back to how you've been maintaining the system. It's not a bad thing. It's just, I think it's indicative of the way you've been maintaining the system. Others I'm finding they're not that far off. And then it also becomes a function of the type of plan that they want created and where they want to be as a payer. So you want to be at the 65th percentile. Not everybody wants to be there. So there's lots of factors that you would have to consider. I think the good news is that communities that would like to look at this are attempting to do so. You know, and one of the things that we do as a result of the survey is send out the results of the salary survey. I mean, people can get the report if they request it, but we do that. So other communities that might put it on their radar screen when they see where they relate, if they're a comp to Southborough and they responded, they might start asking some questions.
Any other concerns, comments, or thoughts? Yes?
I was just wondering about your timeline. I know you're trying to get in for a town meeting, try to probably meet the warrant, but are you perceiving that that's possible, or are you thinking that you might end up, you know, how you're going to work it? And then you're still talking about another percentage of what we're going to do for raises, and how does that all enter into it for next year?
I think that's something we have to do, no matter, regardless of this, and that's something we will do in a future meeting, in a very, what do I want to say? Short order meeting, a meeting in short order. There's a number of things that I'm thinking, and there's some things that are written here, and I think that we as a board have to make the following considerations. And hearing what Joe was saying, that he has to chew on it, and I understand, I think that's probably better than reacting quickly tonight and saying, let's adapt or adopt. But there are a few things in my mind, and I would welcome when you look through this report that you add to this particular list. I'll forward this to you, to my colleagues, that we need to consider adopting a new minimum and maximum range, potentially based on what you've suggested. Vote on whether to bring affected staff up to a new minimum, and who those players are. Approve proposed title changes completely, or in other words, in total, or maybe we make some changes on our own. Review and vote for the suggested changes in job descriptions by departments. Do any job description updates that some are suggesting. In other words, accept those in the next little bit. Determine if the town will move to pay for performance system, merit plus pay for performance, or something that is a hybrid. And consider moving the long-time employees to a longevity disbursement. Now, those are some of the things that are coming up from this, but in answer to your question, I think that will be done within the next few weeks. We're going to have to do that, because if we have to move, and we're dealing with the Board of Selectmen's timelines for I think Brian and Mark's budget presentation. So those are the things that I think we have to do. Am I missing anything in your mind?
Nope.
Okay. Okay.
The most important thing is setting another meeting date in the next week or two.
Yes, and we may do that afterwards, but we'll try to make that happen. We'll put a couple of them on the table. Because this is our busy time, and I think we're going to have to meet a couple of times, maybe in the morning and in an evening. But are there any other comments or questions? This has not been an easy process for either you or for us. I know when we were getting the flurries of emails, and please send them. I mean, we love the email. Maybe we'll start a blog. But I think it's important, when it starts coming at you, you think, holy moly, everybody's mad. But the fact of the matter is that we want to hear from you, especially given, and I hope you know that we as a board are very, very considerate and glad that we've been able to at least try to accommodate the new employees who've joined the SAP. And we want to keep that relationship going. So that's really important. Any other comments or questions? No? Yes, Paul. I was surprised.
Just a global
Yes.
comment is, I know, like you said, everybody's all emotional, and I still have a couple questions or whatever, and I'm still unsure. But at the end of the day, I hope everybody's at least happy that the town has invested money in this and that we're moving forward. I know other communities have done nothing. I've seen some of like Framingham and Marlboro's has done a bunch of them, and they said, yep, you're underpaid, see you later. You know, too bad. I'm just very, very happy that, you know, the taxpayers, the selectmen, you guys have actually put through the process and has put it on the table and has invested money in this and go. No matter what we come up with, it isn't going to be perfect. Not everybody's going to be happy. Fine, but at least we're moving forward. And I hope everybody understands that. And at least to make an attempt to rectify some of the issues we've had in the past and have done this study. And I think it's great. And I appreciate her coming out and doing all the hard work for us. You know?
Are you okay tonight?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm shocked, Wally.
I've heard a lot of people just, I'm all worried about, I think what you get at is, yeah, we're all gonna have our individual questions, and I just think it's great that we're actually doing something, because calling around to a lot of communities, and Ashley and the one that didn't get back to you was, they don't do anything. It's just, I mean, that's pretty sad.
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that, because it's almost, I will say, as soon as you started to say something, Paul, my thought was, in some ways, the members that have been here for a long time on this board, it's almost an embarrassment that this has happened in terms of that. What we were doing, we thought we were doing fairly well. At least we were trying to make some forward progress. But this has certainly been an eye-opener for us. And I think we're going to have to fight a battle on your behalf to try to make some of these things happen because of the cost. And as Bill's behind there, but as many of you know, when you're sitting in the town meeting and somebody stands up and says, I've been laid off for 6 months and you're going to get a $10,000 raise, what the hell is going on? That's going to be an uphill battle for us. You know, we just have to have our ducks in a row and to be able to justify why we're doing what we're doing. Retaining talent is extremely important. Right? Our retention is important. And I think, and I hope you know, for those of you who weren't here before, one of the things that we'll always do with the board here is when people come in for the performance appraisals and they are looking for self-improvement, the question we're asking is, what do you want? What do you need? And how can we make that happen? I'm not going to go and find the course you want to take, but if you bring that forward, we'll find a way to at least partially pay for that with the limited funds that we have, and that's important. So, you know, personnel improvement is extremely important to us, and so I want you to recognize that, please. Okay, hearing nothing, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting. And a second. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight, and thank you, Joe Ellen, for your hard work. See ya.